Karen Wilson was not your typical traveler. At 35, she had spent most of her life working hard as a graphic designer in a small town in Ohio, dreaming of adventures far beyond the confines of her predictable routine. Her days were filled with deadlines and coffee breaks, but her nights often drifted into fantasies of exploring ancient cities, tasting exotic foods, and standing in awe before world-famous landmarks. For years, these dreams remained just that, dreams. But this year, Karen decided it was time to change that. After months of saving every penny and meticulously planning her itinerary, Karen finally booked a week-long trip to London. It wasn't Paris or Rome, but for Karen, London represented everything magical about Europe: history, culture, and royalty. She imagined herself strolling through cobblestone streets, sipping tea at cozy cafes, and snapping photos of iconic sites like Big Ben and the Tower Bridge. However, there was one destination that topped her list: Buckingham Palace. On her third day in the city, Karen woke up early, buzzing with excitement. Today was the day she would see the changing of the guard ceremony, an event she'd watched countless times on YouTube. She slipped into her favorite pair of comfortable walking shoes, grabbed her camera, and tucked a few essentials into her bag. Among those essentials was something she hoped she'd never need: a small canister of pepper spray. Karen hadn't planned to bring it originally, but after hearing stories online about pickpockets and unruly crowds, she figured it was better to be safe than sorry. As she made her way to Buckingham Palace, Karen couldn't help but marvel at how alive the city felt. The streets buzzed with energy, tourists mingling with locals as they hurried toward their destinations. Vendors sold souvenirs and snacks while buskers entertained passers-by with music and tricks. Despite the chaos, Karen found herself smiling. This was exactly what she'd dreamed of: a vibrant, bustling metropolis full of life and surprises. When she arrived at the palace gates, the crowd was already thick. People from all over the world had gathered to witness the spectacle, their cameras poised and ready. Karen squeezed her way closer, craning her neck to get a better view. She noticed families with children, couples holding hands, and even elderly, travelers leaning on canes, all united by their shared anticipation. The air was electric with excitement, punctuated by occasional bursts of laughter and chatter in different languages. The ceremony began shortly after Karen settled into her spot near the front. As the guards marched onto the grounds, their movements, precise and synchronized, Karen felt a shiver run down her spine. There was something mesmerizing about their uniformity, their bright red tunics, polished boots, and towering bearskin hats. They moved like clockwork, each step deliberate and measured. To Karen, it almost seemed surreal, as though she were watching characters step out of a history book. But beneath her admiration lay a growing sense of unease. Karen had always been a bit jumpy, prone to overthinking situations until her imagination ran wild. Standing so close to the guards, who stood perfectly still except for the occasional blink or shift of weight, she started to feel nervous. What if someone tried to disrupt the ceremony? What if tensions escalated between the guards and the crowd? Her mind raced with scenarios, each more dramatic than the last. She glanced around at the other tourists, wondering if anyone else shared her concerns. Most appeared completely unfazed, happily snapping photos and chatting among themselves. A group of teenagers nearby laughed loudly, drawing disapproving looks from some of the older attendees. Karen frowned. Maybe her worries weren't entirely unfounded. After all, she'd read enough news articles about rowdy tourists causing trouble at historic sites. And then there were the guards themselves, whose stoic expressions gave nothing away. Were they trained to handle unruly behavior? Would they react aggressively if provoked? Her thoughts spiraled further when one of the guards nearest to her turned slightly. His movement caught Karen off guard. She hadn't expected him to move at all. In her heightened state of anxiety, she interpreted his action as a sign of aggression. Was he looking at her? Did he think she was too close to the barrier? Her grip tightened on the strap of her bag, and without realizing it, her fingers brushed against the cool metal of the pepper spray inside. Karen's heart began to race. She told herself to calm down, to focus on enjoying the moment instead of letting fear ruin her experience. But the more she tried to shake off her nerves, the more they consumed her. Every shuffle of feet, every murmur in the crowd, felt amplified. Even the rhythmic beat of the drummers accompanying the guard sounded louder, almost threatening. And then, just as she thought she might lose her composure entirely, the guard took another step forward. To anyone else, it might have seemed insignificant, a simple adjustment of position, but to Karen it felt like confirmation of her worst fears. Her breath hitched and her body tensed. Before she could stop herself, her hand darted into her bag, clutching the pepper spray. Her mind screamed at her to reconsider, to take a deep breath and think things through. But panic had taken hold, and logic was nowhere to be found. In that split second, Karen's world narrowed to a single point. The faceless figure in front of her, looming larger than life in her panicked vision. Without another thought, she raised her arm and aimed the canister directly at the guard. The sharp hiss of pepper spray filled the air, slicing through the rhythmic beat of drums and the murmurs of the crowd. For a moment, everything seemed to stop. The guard, his towering figure clad in red and black, crowned with a massive bearskin hat, flinched violently as the spray hit him square in the face. His once stoic expression crumpled into one of shock and pain. He staggered backward, coughing uncontrollably, his hands instinctively flying to his eyes as tears streamed down his cheeks. Karen froze, her arm still extended, the canister trembling in her grip. Around her, the crowd erupted into chaos. Gasps echoed from every direction, followed by shouts and frantic whispers. Some people recoiled in horror, while others whipped out their phones to capture the surreal scene unfolding before them. Parents pulled their children away, shielding them from what appeared to be an escalating confrontation. Tourists exchanged bewildered glances, unsure whether to laugh, scream, or run for cover. At first, Karen couldn't process what she'd just done. Her mind was a jumble of emotions, panic, disbelief, and a creeping sense of dread. She stared at the guard, who was now doubled over, struggling to breathe through the burning sensation in his eyes. Other guards nearby sprang into action, abandoning their rigid formations to assist their comrade. One of them shouted something unintelligible, his voice sharp and commanding, though Karen couldn't make out the words over the din of the crowd. Another guard stepped forward, his posture rigid and intimidating, scanning the area for the source of the disturbance. It didn't take long for the guards, and everyone else, to realize that Karen was the culprit. Her wide-eyed expression, coupled with the fact that she was still holding the pepper spray, left little room for doubt. Security officers stationed around the perimeter quickly moved in, their faces stern and unyielding. They pushed through the throng of onlookers, creating a path toward Karen. As they approached, she felt her stomach drop. Reality crashed down on her like a tidal wave. "What have I done?" Karen whispered to herself, her voice barely audible over the commotion. Her hands shook as she lowered the canister, her earlier bravado replaced by sheer terror. The situation spiraled further out of control when one of the security officers barked an order at her. "Drop it." Instinctively, Karen obeyed, letting the pepper spray clatter to the ground. Her legs felt weak, as though they might give out beneath her at any second. As the officers closed in, Karen's mind raced. Why had she reacted so impulsively? What had possessed her to pull out the pepper spray in the first place? She replayed the moments leading up to the incident in her head, trying desperately to piece together how things had gone so wrong. The guard hadn't been advancing on her. He'd simply shifted positions as part of the ceremony. To anyone familiar with the routine, it would have been obvious. But Karen, caught up in her own spiral of anxiety, had misinterpreted his movements entirely. The security team wasted no time. Two officers grabbed Karen firmly by the arms, pulling her away from the scene. She stumbled slightly, her sneakers scraping against the pavement as she was led toward a nearby holding area. Behind her, the crowd continued to murmur and speculate, their cameras trained on her like spotlights. Some onlookers pointed fingers, whispering harsh judgments under their breath. Others simply gawked, unable to tear their eyes away from the spectacle. Once inside the holding area, a small, sterile room adjacent to the palace grounds, Karen collapsed onto a metal bench, her body trembling. A mix of adrenaline and shame coursed through her veins. She buried her face in her hands, trying to block out the reality of what had just happened. How could she have let her fear get the better of her? And why hadn't she stopped to think before acting? Meanwhile, outside, the holding area, the story spread like wildfire. Videos of the incident began circulating online within minutes, capturing Karen's panicked reaction and the ensuing chaos. Social media platforms lit up with reactions ranging from outrage to ridicule. Memes featuring Karen's horrified expression popped up across Twitter and Instagram, accompanied by captions like "Tourist takes on royalty" and "When you mistake a guard for a threat." Comment sections buzzed with debates about cultural ignorance, personal responsibility, and whether Karen deserved sympathy or scorn. Back home in Ohio, Karen's family remained blissfully unaware of the drama unfolding thousands of miles away. Her parents were likely sipping their morning coffee, oblivious to the fact that their daughter had become an international laughingstock. Her co-workers, too, had no idea that the quiet graphic designer known for her meticulous attention to detail had just made headlines for all the wrong reasons. But Karen wasn't thinking about social media or her reputation at that moment. All she could focus on was the guilt gnawing at her insides. She replayed the image of the guard's pained expression over and over in her mind, each recollection making her feel smaller and more ashamed. What must he have thought of her? Did he believe she was deliberately trying to harm him? Or did he understand that her actions stemmed from sheer panic? Her thoughts were interrupted when a uniformed officer entered the room, carrying a clipboard and a serious expression. "Ms. Wilson," he said, his tone clipped and formal, "we need to ask you a few questions." He gestured for her to follow him into another room, where 2 more officers awaited. Their presence intimidated Karen even further, but she nodded, silently, knowing there was no point in resisting. As she sat down at a table across from the officers, Karen braced herself for what was coming next. The interrogation began with basic questions. Who was she? Where was she from? What had prompted her to bring pepper spray to the ceremony? At first, Karen struggled to articulate her answers, her voice shaky and uneven, but as the officers pressed her for details, she found herself pouring out her thoughts in a torrent of words. I didn't mean to hurt anyone," she stammered, her eyes welling with tears. I thought he was coming toward me. I got scared. I didn't know what to do." Her explanation sounded feeble even to her own ears, but she hoped it might convey the depth of her remorse. The officers listened impassively, jotting notes on their clipboards without offering any reassurance. Throughout the questioning, Karen tried to remind herself that this was just a misunderstanding. Surely, once the authorities understood her side of the story, they'd see that she hadn't intended to cause harm. But deep down, she knew the consequences of her actions wouldn't be easily dismissed. Assaulting a member of the Queen's Guard wasn't something that could be brushed off as a simple mistake. It was a serious offense, one that carried real legal ramifications. By the time the officers finished their initial round of questioning, hours had passed. Karen was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. Her throat was dry, her head throbbed, and her stomach churned with anxiety. Still, she forced herself to stay composed, clinging to the hope that she'd somehow find a way to make amends. As she waited for further instructions, Karen glanced out the window, catching a glimpse of Buckingham Palace in the distance. Just hours ago, she had stood there, awestruck by its grandeur and history. Now the sight of it filled her with a profound sense of regret. Instead of leaving London with cherished memories and stunning photographs, she was facing the possibility of fines, legal trouble, and a tarnished reputation. Despite everything, a small part of Karen refused to give up. She vowed to do whatever it took to fix the damage she'd caused, not just for herself, but for the guard whose day she had ruined. Little did she know, this decision would set her on a path toward redemption, one that would challenge her resilience and teach her lessons she'd carry for the rest of her life. The weight of Karen's actions settled heavily on her shoulders as the officers finalized their report. She sat slumped in the cold, sterile room, staring blankly at the floor. Her mind replayed every detail of the incident: the guard's startled expression, The horrified gasps from the crowd and the sharp hiss of the pepper spray echoing like a gunshot through the crisp London air. Each memory felt like a fresh wound, reopening with every passing second. Eventually, one of the officers returned, holding a clipboard and speaking in a tone that was firm, but not unkind. "Ms. Wilson," he began, "you are being charged with assault and public disorder. These are serious offenses, especially given the circumstances." He paused, letting the gravity of his words sink in before continuing. "You will need to appear in court to address these charges. Until then, we'll require your passport and contact information to ensure you don't leave the country." Karen nodded numbly, her hands trembling as she handed over her passport. The officer explained that she would also be issued a summons for her court appearance, which was tentatively scheduled for later in the week. Though she understood the necessity of the process, it did little to ease her growing anxiety. Assaulting a member of the Queen's Guard wasn't just a legal issue. It was a cultural misstep, an embarrassment broadcasted globally. Karen couldn't shake the feeling that she had let everyone down: herself, her family, the Guard, and even the institution he represented. Once the formalities were completed, Karen was released with strict instructions to remain available for further questioning. As she stepped outside the holding area, the reality of her situation hit her like a freight train. The palace grounds were eerily quiet now, devoid of the lively crowds and ceremonial pomp that had filled them earlier. A few security personnel lingered nearby, casting wary glances in her direction. Cameras still clicked faintly in the distance, capturing her every move as journalists and curious onlookers documented the aftermath of the bizarre incident. Her phone buzzed incessantly in her pocket, vibrating against her leg like a guilty reminder of the chaos she'd caused. Reluctantly, she pulled it out and unlocked the screen. Her heart sank as notifications flooded in: missed calls, text messages, and social media alerts. Friends and family back home had seen the headlines. "Karen, is this really you?" read one message from her sister. Another friend simply sent a link to a viral video of the incident, captioned with a worried emoji. Taking a deep breath, Karen scrolled through the comments online. Some people mocked her outright, dubbing her "Pepper Spray Karen," or joking about her attack on royalty. Others expressed sympathy, suggesting that her reaction, while extreme, might have stemmed from fear rather than malice. But regardless of the tone, the sheer volume of attention overwhelmed her. For the first time in her life, Karen felt truly exposed, her private panic made painfully public. Determined to take responsibility, she decided to call her parents. It was late evening in Ohio, and she knew they'd likely be winding down for the night. Dialing their number, she braced herself for the conversation ahead. When her mother answered, Karen barely managed to choke out a greeting before breaking down in tears. Between sobs, she confessed everything: the pepper spray, the Guard, the arrest, and the impending court date. Her mother listened silently, absorbing the story with a mix of shock and concern. "Oh, Karen," her mom finally said, her voice tinged with both disappointment and love. "What were you thinking? You've always been so level-headed. This just doesn't sound like you." "I don't know what happened," Karen replied, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I got scared, Mom. I thought something bad was going to happen and I reacted without thinking. Now I'm paying for it." Her father joined the call shortly after, his gruff voice cutting through the line. While less emotional than her mother, his frustration was evident. "This is serious, Karen. You can't just act impulsively like this, especially in another country. Do you realize how much trouble you're in?" Karen nodded, though they couldn't see her. "I know, Dad. Believe me, I know. I feel terrible about what I did. I never meant to hurt anyone. I messed up." After hanging up, Karen felt a strange mix of relief and guilt. Talking to her parents had been cathartic, but it also underscored the magnitude of her mistake. She realized she needed to do more than apologize. She needed to make amends. That night, unable to sleep, she drafted a heartfelt letter addressed to the injured Guard. In it, she expressed her deepest regret, explaining that her actions were born out of fear rather than hostility. She promised to take full responsibility for her behavior and vowed to learn from the experience. The next morning, Karen visited the local police station to deliver the letter, hoping it might reach the guard directly. The receptionist accepted it reluctantly, assuring her it would be forwarded to the appropriate authorities. Though Karen doubted the gesture would undo the damage, it gave her a small sense of closure. She spent the rest of the day wandering aimlessly through Hyde Park, trying to clear her head. The lush greenery and tranquil atmosphere provided a temporary escape from the storm brewing around her. As the days passed, Karen became increasingly aware of the ripple effects of her actions. News outlets continued to cover the story, dissecting every angle, from her motivations to the potential diplomatic fallout. Legal experts weighed in on television panels, debating whether her case warranted leniency or stricter penalties. Meanwhile, Buckingham Palace issued a brief statement condemning the incident, but emphasizing the professionalism and resilience of the guards involved. Amidst the criticism and scrutiny, however, some voices emerged in Karen's defense. A British journalist wrote an op-ed arguing that tourists often misunderstand the rigid protocols surrounding royal ceremonies, leading to unnecessary tension. Another commentator pointed out that Karen's reaction, while reckless, reflected a broader issue: the lack of education about cultural norms for international travelers. These perspectives offered Karen a glimmer of hope, reminding her that mistakes, no matter how egregious, could sometimes spark meaningful conversations. On the morning of her court appearance, Karen dressed carefully, opting for simple yet respectful attire. She arrived early, clutching her notes and rehearsing her apology in her head. The courtroom was small but packed with spectators, including reporters eager to document the proceedings. As she took her seat, Karen felt a surge of nerves. This was it, the moment where she would face the consequences of her actions head-on. When the judge entered, the room fell silent. The prosecutor outlined the charges against Karen, emphasizing the seriousness of assaulting a member of the Queen's Guard. Then it was Karen's turn to speak. Standing nervously before the bench, she delivered her prepared statement, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. She apologized profusely, acknowledging the harm she had caused and pledging to use the experience as a catalyst for personal growth. To her surprise, the guard who had been affected by the pepper spray chose to attend the hearing. His presence unnerved her, but when their eyes met briefly, she saw a flicker of understanding. Not forgiveness, perhaps, but acknowledgement of her sincerity. In the end, the judge sentenced Karen to community service and ordered her to pay a fine. While relieved to avoid jail time, Karen knew the real work lay ahead. She resolved to channel her remorse into action, volunteering with organizations focused on promoting cultural awareness and responsible tourism. Through workshops and public speaking engagements, she shared her story, urging others to think critically before acting impulsively. Slowly but surely, Karen began to rebuild her reputation, transforming her mistake into a lesson that resonated far beyond her own experience. Though the scars of the incident would linger, Karen emerged stronger and wiser, a testament to the power of accountability and redemption. The courtroom was silent except for the faint rustle of papers and the occasional shuffle of feet. Karen stood before the judge, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it. The air felt heavy, charged with anticipation as the prosecutor finished summarizing the case against her. Assaulting a member of the Queen's Guard, an offense that carried not just legal weight but cultural significance, was no small matter. Karen had braced herself for the worst, imagining scenarios where she might face jail time or deportation. But as the judge began to speak, his tone was measured, neither harsh nor overly lenient. "Ms. Wilson," he said, addressing her directly, "your actions have caused significant disruption and distress, both to the individual involved and to the institution he represents. However, I note your sincere apology and your willingness to take responsibility for your behavior." He paused, glancing down at the documents in front of him. "Given these factors, I am inclined to show some leniency. You are hereby sentenced to 100 hours of community service and fined $2,500. Furthermore, you will be required to attend a mandatory course on cultural awareness and responsible tourism. Karen exhaled deeply, relief washing over her like a wave. She had expected far worse, and while the penalties were still substantial, they gave her a chance to make amends without derailing her life entirely. As the gavel struck the desk, signaling the conclusion of the hearing, Karen bowed her head, slightly, mouthing a silent thank you to the judge. The guard whose eyes had briefly met hers earlier nodded almost imperceptibly, a gesture that spoke volumes. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was acknowledgement, a small step toward healing the rift her panic had created. A new beginning. Leaving the courthouse, Karen felt lighter, though the burden of guilt remained. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Paying the fine would strain her finances significantly, forcing her to dip into savings she'd set aside for future travel. And the community service commitment meant weeks, if not months, of hard work, balancing her obligations with her job back home. But Karen saw this as an opportunity, a chance to turn her mistake into something meaningful. Her first task was finding organizations where she could fulfill her community service hours. After some research, she connected with a local nonprofit called Cultural Bridges, which focused on educating tourists about British customs, history, and etiquette. Their mission resonated deeply with Karen, who now understood firsthand how ignorance could lead to unintended consequences. She reached out to them, explaining her situation and expressing her desire to contribute. To her surprise, they welcomed her warmly, seeing her story as a powerful tool to drive their message home. Karen's role with Cultural Bridges involved leading workshops for incoming tourists. At first, standing in front of groups made her nervous. Memories of the incident lingered, and she worried people might recognize her or judge her harshly. But as she began sharing her experience openly, something remarkable happened. People listened. Her vulnerability disarmed even the most skeptical attendees, turning what could have been awkward lectures into engaging conversations. She talked about the importance of respecting boundaries, understanding cultural norms, and thinking critically before acting impulsively. One particular session stood out. A group of high school students from Texas had come to London as part of an educational exchange program. They were lively and curious, peppering Karen with questions about everything from Big Ben to fish and chips. When Karen introduced herself and shared her story, the room fell silent. One student raised her hand hesitantly. "Why did you bring pepper spray?" she asked. Karen smiled faintly, appreciating the honesty of the question. "I brought it because I thought I needed protection," she admitted. "But looking back, I realize I let fear cloud my judgment. Instead of staying calm and observing, I jumped to conclusions, and it cost me dearly." The students nodded thoughtfully, many scribbling notes in their journals. By the end of the session, several approached Karen to thank her for being so candid. "You're brave for telling us this," one boy said earnestly. His words stayed with Karen long after the group left, reminding her that vulnerability often inspires growth, not just in others, but in oneself. Facing public scrutiny. While Karen found purpose in her volunteer work, the court ruling didn't magically erase the public scrutiny surrounding her case. Social media continued to buzz with reactions, ranging from mockery to genuine curiosity. Some commenters criticized her for what they perceived as irresponsibility, while others praised her efforts to make amends. Journalists occasionally reached out for interviews, eager to document her journey from pepper spray Karen to advocate for cultural awareness. At first, Karen hesitated to engage with the media. The idea of reliving the incident publicly terrified her. But after consulting with her lawyer, who encouraged her to control the narrative, she agreed to sit down for a few select interviews. In each conversation, Karen emphasized accountability. She acknowledged her mistake, expressed gratitude for the guard's forgiveness, and highlighted the lessons she'd learned along the way. One interview, conducted by a prominent British news outlet, went viral. Sitting across from the interviewer, Karen spoke candidly about her anxiety, her impulsive decision, and her determination to grow from the experience. "I never wanted to hurt anyone," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. What I did was wrong, and I'll carry that regret with me forever. But if my story helps even one person think twice before acting out of fear, then maybe something good can come from all of this. The response was overwhelmingly positive. Viewers praised Karen's honesty and resilience, noting how rare it was to see someone confront their mistakes so openly. For the first time since the incident, Karen began to feel less defined by her error and more empowered by her ability to rise above it. Reconnecting with the Guard as part of her community service, Karen participated in a special event hosted by Buckingham Palace aimed at fostering better relationships between tourists and the Royal Guards. It was here that she finally had the opportunity to meet the guard she had sprayed face to face. His name was Corporal James Carter, and he greeted her with a polite nod, his demeanor professional yet warm. "I want to apologize again," Karen said, her voice trembling slightly. "I can't tell you how sorry I am for what I did. I hope someday you'll be able to forgive me." James regarded her for a moment before responding. "Thank you for saying that," he said quietly. "It took courage to come forward and own up to your actions. I appreciate that." He paused, then added with a hint of humor, "And don't worry, I've recovered fully. No lasting damage." Though brief, the interaction meant the world to Karen. It wasn't absolution, but it was progress, a mutual understanding that allowed both parties to move forward. As they parted ways, Karen felt a weight lift off her shoulders, as though the final piece of her redemption puzzle had fallen into place. A shift in perspective back home in Ohio, Karen returned to her routine, though she was no longer the same person she'd been before her trip to London. The experience had changed her in profound ways, teaching her patience, empathy, and the value of second chances. She threw herself into her advocacy work, collaborating with organizations worldwide to promote responsible tourism. Her story became a cornerstone of her presentations, inspiring countless travelers to approach new cultures with respect and mindfulness. Karen also kept in touch with James via email, maintaining a friendship born out of adversity. They exchanged updates about their lives, occasionally reminiscing about the infamous day that had brought them together. Though their worlds couldn't have been more different, they shared a bond forged through accountability and grace. Looking back, Karen realized that her ill-fated visit to Buckingham Palace had been a turning point, a moment of recklessness that ultimately led to growth and transformation. Life, she mused, had a funny way of teaching its hardest lessons when you least expected them. And sometimes those lessons turned out to be the greatest gifts of all. Months had passed since Karen's fateful encounter at Buckingham Palace, and while the sting of embarrassment still lingered, she found herself in a place she never imagined. Peace. Not the kind of peace that comes from forgetting your mistakes, but the kind born out of owning them, learning from them, and using them to create something meaningful. Her journey wasn't easy, far from it, but every step forward brought her closer to redemption. Karen's days were now filled with purpose. She spent hours volunteering with cultural bridges, leading workshops for tourists arriving in London. Each session began with her sharing her story, not as a cautionary tale meant to shame others, but as an honest reflection on how fear and misunderstanding can lead to poor decisions. "I'm not here to tell you what to do," she often said, pacing gently in front of the room. "I'm here because I made a huge mistake and I want to help you avoid making one like it." Her openness struck a chord with participants. Many came into the workshop skeptical, expecting dry lectures about rules and regulations. Instead, they left feeling inspired, armed with practical advice and a deeper appreciation for cultural sensitivity. One elderly couple from Canada told Karen after a session, "We thought this would be boring, but hearing your story changed everything. We'll think twice before jumping to conclusions when we travel." Word of Karen's efforts spread beyond London. Tourism boards and educational programs across Europe began inviting her to speak at conferences and seminars. At first, she hesitated. Public speaking didn't come naturally to her, and the thought of addressing large crowds intimidated her. But with encouragement from her colleagues at cultural bridges, she pushed past her fears. By the third conference, She was delivering speeches with confidence, weaving humor and humility into her presentations to keep audiences engaged. One event, held in Paris, proved particularly transformative. The audience included not only tourists but also members of law enforcement and diplomatic staff, tasked with managing interactions between visitors and local authorities. As Karen recounted the chaos of that day outside Buckingham Palace, she saw nods of understanding ripple through the crowd. Afterward, several attendees approached her to share their own experiences dealing with similar incidents. A police officer from Rome confided, "We see things like this all the time. People get scared or confused, and they react without thinking. Your story gives us hope that education can make a difference." Building connections, Karen's relationship with Corporal James Carter continued to evolve, blossoming into an unlikely friendship. They exchanged emails regularly, discussing everything from their respective careers to their shared love of history. James occasionally sent photos of ceremonial events, jokingly captioning them with lines like, "No pepper spray allowed." Karen laughed at his lightheartedness, grateful for his ability to move past the incident with grace. Their correspondence eventually led to an invitation Karen hadn't anticipated. The British Army organized an annual gala to celebrate the contributions of its guards and promote goodwill between military personnel and civilians. To Karen's astonishment, James nominated her to attend as a guest speaker. "You've done so much to raise awareness," he wrote in his email. "It's time for people to hear your full story, not just the headlines." The night of the gala arrived and Karen stood nervously backstage, adjusting her dress and rehearsing her speech under her breath. When her name was called, she walked onto the stage to polite applause. As she scanned the room, she spotted James seated near, the front giving her an encouraging thumbs up. Taking a deep breath, she began. "Good evening," she started, smiling warmly. "When I received this invitation, I'll admit I was shocked. Me? Speaking at a gala honoring the very institution I once, well, let's just say, disrupted?" The audience chuckled, easing the tension. Karen continued, recounting her panic at the palace gates, her impulsive decision to use pepper spray, and the whirlwind of consequences that followed. But she didn't stop there. She spoke passionately about the lessons she'd learned, the friendships she'd forged, and the importance of bridging cultural divides. By the end of her speech, the room erupted in applause. Several attendees approached her afterward, shaking her hand and thanking her for her candor. One woman, a retired teacher from Manchester, hugged her tightly. "You're proof that people can change," she whispered. "Never forget that." A new chapter back in Ohio, Karen returned to her graphic design job, but her life had taken on new dimensions. Her advocacy work earned her recognition within her community, and she was invited to join a local committee focused on promoting global citizenship among students. Schools welcomed her to give talks, and parents praised her for instilling values of empathy and responsibility in their children. Her family, too, noticed the shift in her demeanor. Gone was the anxious, overthinking Karen who second-guessed every decision. In her place stood someone confident, resilient, and deeply committed to making a positive impact. Her mother joked during one phone call, "If I didn't know better, I'd swear you were running for office." But perhaps the most significant change was internal. Karen no longer saw herself as merely the woman who pepper-sprayed a royal guard. She was a storyteller, an advocate, and a bridge builder. Her experience taught her that everyone makes mistakes, but true growth lies in how you respond to them. Rather than hiding from her past, she embraced it, allowing it to shape her into someone stronger and wiser. Reflections and gratitude on quiet evenings, Karen often sat by her window, sipping tea and reflecting on how far she'd come. She kept a journal where she wrote down moments of gratitude, small victories, supportive messages from strangers, and reminders of why she chose this path. One entry read, "Today, a student emailed me to say my workshop helped him feel less nervous about traveling abroad. He said he used to worry about messing up or offending someone, but now he feels ready to embrace new experiences. That's why I do this, to help people see the world as a place full of wonder, not fear." Another entry captured her thoughts about James. James texted me today to say he's been promoted to sergeant. I couldn't be prouder of him. Our friendship is proof that even the most unlikely connections can lead to beautiful outcomes. Thank you, James, for showing me forgiveness and patience. You've changed my life more than you know. Legacy of growth years later. Karen's story became part of a documentary series exploring cultural misunderstandings and the power of redemption. Filmmakers interviewed her, James, and others involved in her journey, capturing both the humor and humanity of the incident. The episode aired internationally, sparking conversations about the importance of cultural education and personal accountability. Karen watched the premiere surrounded by friends and family. As scenes of her early panic and subsequent advocacy played on screen, she felt tears welling up, not of sadness but of pride. She had turned a moment of sheer chaos into a catalyst for change, proving that even the biggest blunders could yield unexpected blessings. In the final scene of the documentary, Karen stood outside Buckingham Palace, gazing up at its grand facade. "This place will always remind me of my lowest point," she said softly. "But it also reminds me of how far I've come. Life has a funny way of teaching us lessons when we least expect them, and sometimes those lessons turn out to be the greatest gifts of all." As the credits rolled, Karen smiled, knowing she had finally closed the chapter on her past while opening doors to a brighter,